Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, here to talk to you about the various different mistakes that you might make when building your gaming PC. Errors that people have made and I've seen commonly in questions on my Discord, in comments on my YouTube videos, and on Reddit and other places on the web. Issues that I've come across, even mistakes that I've made in the past that I want you to be aware of so you don't make the same things. I'm going to break this down into sections and talk about various different parts and things that you might do wrong when installing them. And I'm going to start with the graphics card. So one of the basic things you want to do is to make sure you install your GPU, whether it's AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, or whatever else. You want to use the top slot on the motherboard. The X16 slot at the top, that PCIe slot, is the best because it gives you the best bandwidth and the most performance. If you install it in a lower slot, the middle or the bottom slot, you might find that you don't get the most amount of performance out of it. You might get less FPS and you might just get a worse experience from it without even realizing. I've seen people do this in questions and on Reddit and other places, just installing it in a lower slot for God knows what reason. There's no logic to it, but if you're not aware, it makes sense. It fits. Why not put it there? But the slot closer to the CPU is the one that will give you the most lanes on most motherboards. It will give you the best performance there. This is especially important if you've got a new GPU like the latest Intel or NVIDIA GPUs, which are PCIe Gen 5 and need to make the most of that bandwidth. The other issue that's really easy to make mistakes with is the power cable installation on your graphics card. And this applies to basically all GPUs, no matter which type. So for example, if we look at the older types or the cables that are used for Intel and AMD GPUs at the moment, these are the standard 8-pin PCIe cables. Now, there are a couple of different mistakes that you can make with this, and it's really easy to do. First of all, the cable's split into two parts, a 6-pin and a 2-pin. You need to make sure that both parts of this cable are pushed in fully into the GPU. If not done correctly, it's really easy to accidentally have one part of that connector be loose, with the 2-pin part, for example, not being seated all the way in. So the thing to do here is to actually push the 2-pin part in first, and then push the 6-pin part in as well, pinching them together essentially and pushing them all the way in so they're fully seated. You want to do this because it's really easy to accidentally have part of that loose and not realize it. And if it's not fully seated, your GPU might underperform. You might get less FPS, you might get crashes, you might get other issues. The other thing, of course, is to use all the cables that you need, and where possible to use a cable dedicated to one port. So if you have, for example, a 3090, you want to make sure that you've got two cables for each of the connectors, not one of those pigtail cables that has an extra cable coming out of it that connects to the port, but two separate dedicated cables for that connection. Do this wherever possible, even if you've got a graphics card that requires 3 PCIe power cables, and that's really important. Now, with the 50 series or 40 series from NVIDIA, where you have the 12-volt 2x6 power connector, or the 12-volt high power connector as it was previously known, it's really important that cable is also seated properly and pushed all the way in. There are various different issues with those connectors, and you've probably seen the horror stories of them melting or catching fire if they're not seated properly. So you need to make sure both on the power supply end and on the GPU end, it's pushed all the way in and firmly seated. Now, some of these come with colored pins, blue or yellow, for example, so that you can see when they're pushed all the way in, and you shouldn't be able to see the color when it is fully seated. This is important for the same reasons as I mentioned. It needs to make sure it's getting the right amount of power, but also, obviously, you don't want it to melt at any point. Another simple mistake that people make is using an HDMI cable or a DisplayPort cable plugged directly into the motherboard instead of into the graphics card and then connected up to the monitor. Now, it's theoretically possible if you've got a CPU which includes onboard graphics on it to use an HDMI cable plugged into the motherboard and plugged into the monitor, and it will work. But what will happen is you won't have as much performance. The FPS won't be as high and games won't be as smooth. And in some extreme cases, it may cause your PC to crash. You're meant to connect directly to the graphics card, plug in a cable into the GPU and then into the monitor. So it's really important to do that. It'll make sure you get the maximum performance out of your GPU and out of your system. You also want to make sure you download and run the latest drivers for your graphics card so you get the best performance there, optimized for the latest games and such as well. So download AMD, Intel or NVIDIA drivers for your GPU as soon as you've got it installed. I'd recommend using DDU to uninstall previous drivers if this is an update to a newer system, so you can do a fresh install of the latest drivers. Otherwise there might be a conflict and it might not run as well. I've got separate videos that I'll link to in the description which go into more depth on all these things that will hopefully be useful to you as well. Another simple thing to overlook when it comes to the graphics card is actually in Windows itself. So if you've got a fancy monitor like a fast refresh rate monitor, obviously you want to make sure that you're maximizing the use of the refresh rate. As standard, you might find it defaults to 60 Hz refresh rate in Windows. You can find this from the advanced display settings by right-clicking on Windows, going to the display settings, scrolling down to the monitor, advanced settings in there, and then changing it to whatever your monitor's refresh rate is, whether it's 120 or 240 Hz. Otherwise, you'll find you're just running at 60 Hz refresh rate. Again, I've got a separate video on this that I'll link to in the description, which goes into more depth on getting the most out of your monitor. Next up is your all-in-one cooler. Now, I've done a video separately on why your CPU might be getting too hot, but it's really easy during the installation of your all-in-one cooler to accidentally not seat the pump down properly over the CPU. There are a number of different things to be aware of. Obviously, you need to make sure you peel any stickers off of the copper plate before you put it on. You also need to make sure thermal paste is applied if it's not already pre-applied to the pump. But the one simple mistake that people might make, and it's really easy to do, and I've done it myself a couple of times in the past, is to not seat the cooler down properly over the socket. What you want to do is to make sure that when you screw your thumb screws in, that they're tightened up sufficiently in all four corners around the pump. If it's not done correctly and you don't tighten them up nicely, so I usually recommend using a screwdriver to finish it off to make sure they're nice and tight, then the plate won't make good contact with the CPU, and the CPU might then get too hot because it's just not making that contact enough to then disperse the heat and cool the CPU down. So it's not effectively working correctly there. There are a number of other things that you could have done or could do during the installation process which can also cause issues here. There are different types of standoffs, for example, included with all-in-one coolers. When you go to install them on the socket around the CPU into the four corners there, you usually have these little standoffs which screw into there. And you'll have different versions depending on the socket type of your motherboard. Whether, for example, it's LGA 1200, 1700, 1851, or AMD's AM4 or AM5 socket, they can have different standoffs included in the box with the all-in-one cooler, and the instructions will tell you which ones to use. But sometimes it's really easy to overlook little simple things. On some coolers, for example, I found that the AMD AM5 ones basically have a thicker thread on one end of the standoff than on the other. And you need to make sure that bit is the bit that's screwed into the hole on the motherboard, because if you use the other side, the thin bit, then a standoff screw won't screw all the way in properly and it will be loose. And then when you seat your cooler down over the top, it's then not making good contact. It's not installing correctly. And then again, your CPU's getting too hot, your system's overheating, it's maybe shutting down. It's really easy to do this. The other thing is obviously not using enough thermal paste or using too much, which is a careful balance. But I generally like to apply a little bit of thermal paste and then make sure to use a spatula to cover the entirety of the top of the CPU. And it's really easy to make sure you've got a good coating on there. And you can test afterwards once you get into Windows by running Cinebench and other benchmarking tools and using something like Hardware Info 64 to then just check to make sure all the cores are at a reasonable temperature and that they're roughly the same. If you find that any are running particularly too hot or hotter than the others, it might be the thermal paste hasn't been applied correctly to the top of the CPU, and therefore some of them are getting hotter than others. The other thing that is easy to do is to accidentally damage the thermal paste during the installation. So if it's pre-applied thermal paste and you're just putting the cooler down over the CPU, it's really easy to accidentally either rub it during the process, to knock some of it off. I've accidentally taken some off with a plastic cap when that comes away, and then there's a gap in the thermal paste, and then when you apply it, it doesn't necessarily spread properly, and so that can cause issues as well. There are good solutions as alternatives if you're not sure about thermal paste or if it's a bit of a concern. You can get thermal pads from Thermal Grizzly, for example, which you can just put over the top. So instead of paste, it's just like a thin pad that just sits down over the top of the CPU, and then you put your cooler on top of it. You don't need to worry about the thickness or thinness of the thermal paste because there isn't any. It's just this pad that disperses the heat. Instead, it's really cool. It's really easy to install. I've got one in my system, and I've done a separate video recommending how to do it and why they're good. Now, fans is another thing that people make mistakes with. I've done it myself in the past. It's really easy to make errors, especially now with the reverse blade and standard blade fans. That can get a bit confusing, and you might have seen other people with a system that you wanted to copy. Let's say on Reddit, for example, you've seen photos of somebody's PC build. They're using Leland's Infinity fans, and you can see the fan blades and the mirrors on every single fan in their case, and you think, wow, that looks great, and then you copy it. But what you don't realize is they've used reverse blade fans and in some of the positions, and then you've ended up with basically standard fans throughout, which then means the airflow is basically going all in the same direction. It's really easy to do this because you basically install the fans in a way that when you look into your case, you want it to look nice. And so you end up putting them that way, facing what you think is the right way, just because it looks good. And actually what you've done there is basically now all the fans are basically exhausting air out of the case rather than intake. So there's literally no intake. The case isn't getting any fresh air coming in. It's all just trying to push air out. Or the other way around, perhaps, and everything's intake instead. There's crazy things that can happen. It's really easy to make mistakes like this. I've covered these sorts of things in the past in dedicated videos, but essentially the easiest thing to do is to make sure the side or front and bottom are intake, top and rear are exhaust, and you want to be able to see the fan blades on a standard fan for exhaust and the back of them for intake. So if you put the front facing outwards and the back's visible from the inside, that means it's an intake fan. If it's standard, if it's reverse blade, it's a little bit different. But I've got videos, again, that I'll link to in the description that will help with that. If you're using PWM fans, and you might find like Noctua as fans, for example, or any fan that connects directly to the motherboard, especially if you're using 4-pin connections, connects directly to the motherboard to chassis fan headers or system fan headers, then you need to go into the BIOS and change the settings. If you just plug them in and then you're running your PC and you find it really loud, like very loud all the time, then it could be that you just need to tweak your settings in the BIOS. So if you go into the BIOS and go into the fan settings in there, you can then basically turn it to PWM mode from the drop down there. Rather than being auto, you want to choose PWM mode. You'll find this is a really simple fix. It basically allows the motherboard to adjust the speed of the fans according to the temperature of your system. If you find that doesn't work and your system is still really loud all the time, it could be that it's just running too hot. So it could be some of the mistakes that I've said about the all-in-one cooler, for example. Your CPU's just running too hot. It's not got good airflow. It's just overheating all the time. So the fans are spinning at maximum speed to try and compensate for that. RAM is another simple mistake that people make. And there are various different mistakes that you can make with it. One of the most common and easiest mistake to make is not realizing where you're meant to install it. When you get RAM, invariably you get it in packs of 2, so you get 2 sticks of RAM, and that is basically what you want. For modern motherboards, it's DDR5 RAM, unless you've got an older motherboard, and it'll be DDR4, but most recent motherboards, you want DDR5 RAM, and you'll usually get 2 sticks of it. And 2 sticks is generally the most stable, rather than getting 4. Sometimes 4 sticks can be unstable, but more on that in a second. What you want to do is to install the RAM into the 2nd slot and the 4th slot. Now, invariably, new builders or beginners will install the sticks in the 1st and 2nd slots. It's kind of logical. If you've not read the manual, you know nothing about building a PC, and you just want to do it, you put the RAM into those first 2 slots and think that's fine. It's not fine. The motherboards are generally designed so that the 2nd and 4th slots are the ones you want to use to make sure that they're getting the right amount of bandwidth and that they run at the right speeds and everything else. If you put them in the wrong slots, then you're basically hampering the speed of your system and it won't work properly. So make sure it's slots A2 and B2, generally speaking, and you'll even see on some motherboards that are color-coded where those 2 slots are grey, for example, and the other 2 slots are black. If you refer to the motherboard manual, you'll see this in there, but a lot of people just don't look at the manual and just make an assumption. And worse, some people just put one stick in slot 1 and think that's fine and don't even populate the other slot. The other thing people will do is that they'll get 2 sticks of RAM and then later on they'll think, I'll upgrade and I'll get some more. One of my friends did this. They had 2 sticks of RAM in their system. Somehow they managed to get hold of 2 other sticks of RAM from a completely different brand with completely different speeds and completely different capacity. So let's say they had 2 sticks which added up to 32 gigabytes total. So they got 2 sticks of 16. They got 2 additional sticks that were 8 gigabytes each and different speeds entirely, so different megahertz speeds, and they put them in the other slots and they thought that was fine. That, generally speaking, is not a good idea because invariably the BIOS will try and use the slower speeds and it can lead to other problems as well. It's basically not worth doing. You want to make sure that you've got RAM that's the same capacity and the same speeds and the same timings, so it's a bit more complex than that. Basically, you want to buy the same amount of RAM. Now, if you're going to fill 4 slots, just get 2 identical kits, or you can even buy kits that are 4 sticks, or get 2 sticks and then 2 lighting enhancement kits from Corsair, for example. So the RAM just matches up if you want, and it's 2 dummy sticks of RAM and 2 nice ones. You can also get really high capacity sticks now. You can have 2 sticks and it'll add up to 96 gigabytes, for example. It's bonkers, so you don't even need 4. The other mistake people make is not going into the BIOS and turning on XMP. So if you've got 2 sticks, you want to go into the BIOS and turn on XMP or the AMD alternative to this, which is Expo, and that will make sure that the RAM actually runs at the maximum speed, because if you just leave it as default, it won't. It'll run at half the speed that it's advertised at. So obviously you want to make sure you go into the BIOS. Invariably, it's on the first page of the BIOS. It's really easy to see. Just turn on XMP and that's fine. Now, you might find that when you turn on your PC, it then doesn't boot properly and it has issues, and then you have to reset the BIOS and start again. Now, it could be either you've got your sticks installed in the wrong slots, or there could be something wrong with one of the sticks of RAM, or you might need to update your BIOS. So updating your BIOS can be beneficial. Now, it can be scary, but I've got separate guides on how to update your BIOS. It's not that bad, really. You'll hear horror stories about how dangerous it is, but I've updated a lot of BIOSes over the years, and I've never had a problem. Basically, updating the BIOS is worth doing. It's a little bit more complicated than updating drivers, for example. But the process is worth doing, because if you look at your motherboard's website, and you will find a long list of BIOS updates, probably since you bought it, and you'll also see improvements to it, and that can include things like improvements to XMP stability. So if you are having issues with RAM not working properly or your system not running XMP nicely, then doing a BIOS update can really help with that, and it's a nice simple fix for that. The other thing is it'll also lead to other improvements, like it might improve system stability, for example. It might fix any RGB issues you've got on your system, and there are other things. If you're running an Intel 13th or 14th gen CPU, I highly recommend updating the BIOS on your motherboard. If you've got a Z690 or Z790 motherboard, you want to make sure you're running the latest BIOS. There were chipset changes and improvements to stability there, which will ensure the longevity of your Intel CPU. This is especially important if you're using an i7 or an i9 processor. You want to make sure it lasts. Get that BIOS updated as soon as possible. That's highly recommended. Now, another thing that people often do is related to NVMe SSDs. So there are a number of different mistakes that you can make regarding NVMEs, and I've talked about this in the past because there's actually some complexities to it. So I'm going to start with a few different things. First of all is getting an NVMe SSD that matches your system. So if you have a new motherboard, it's worth checking out the specs of the motherboard even before you've bought it, because you might find that you have different ports on the motherboard and some support different generations of NVMe. So you might have a motherboard that supports at the top slot just below the CPU is a Gen 5 NVMe port. The other ports on the motherboard might be Gen 4, and those will run at different speeds. And you need to make sure you've got the right drive to support it. So if you have a Crucial T710, for example, as an example, that's a PCIe Gen 5 drive. It's designed to run at a maximum speed of something like 14,000 megabytes a second. If you take that drive and you put it into a PCIe Gen 4 slot, you'll find that it will not run at those speeds. It will run about half the speeds because it's going to basically not be able to use the bandwidth that's required. So it'll get 7,000 something megabytes per second instead of 14. So you've then half the performance of the drive, and you've bought a drive for your system that you're not making the most of. Now, it is compatible. They are backwards compatible. So you could equally put a PCIe Gen 3 drive into a Gen 5 slot, but obviously you'd only get Gen 3 speeds. So it's worth knowing that. You can put an NVMe into an NVMe port on your motherboard easily without worry about that, but you won't get maximum performance out of it. The other thing is that sometimes the bandwidth of a port on the motherboard will actually vary depending on how many you've populated. So if you buy 3 NVMe SSDs, you might find that they're not all running at the maximum speed because some of the ports might have their bandwidth halved. They might get 2 lanes instead of 4, so they get half the amount of speed they would do. Again, it would be like 3,500 instead of 7,000, or 7,000 instead of 14,000 megabytes a second, because the bandwidth has been halved. So although it's right sort of lane, so let's say a Gen 4 drive goes into a Gen 4 slot, it's only getting 2 lanes instead of 4 lanes, and so it's getting half the performance. It's important to refer to the motherboard manual for this and to the bifurcation tables, which essentially say if you populate all of these different slots, then this will happen to the bandwidth of those. It's a bit complex, especially if you're new to building. If you're just putting 1 drive into your system, you'll probably be fine. And in most cases, if you're only putting 2 drives in, you'll probably be fine as well. So it's not an issue. But if you've got a motherboard that supports like 5 ports and you fill them all up, you might find the bandwidth is reduced because of it. Another thing people will do is to peel the stickers off their NVMe SSDs, even though it says warranty void if you do so. I've actually done some experiments, and other people have as well. And if you do peel that sticker off, it can actually have a negative impact on the performance of the cooling. Some of those stickers aren't just stickers. They actually have some materials in there to help with heat dissipation. So peeling them off actually means the drive gets hotter, and that can lead to problems. And in terms of the heating, the other thing you want to do is to make sure you're using the heat shields on your motherboard. So some motherboards will come with heat sinks. Some of them are very big heat sinks, and they'll have thermal pads on the underside. Peel the sticker off that, insert the thermal pad on top of the drive with the heatsink on top of it. It will help dissipate heat. This is especially important on PCIe Gen 5 drives, which can run really hot when under heavy load. And when they do that, they will then throttle the performance. So again, suddenly you're not getting as much speed out of your drive. And worse, sometimes they might completely fail or just stop working because they've got too hot. So they shut down, and then you can't access the files anymore. Or worse, your system just freezes because of it. So make sure you're using a good quality heatsink, a nice big one. Sometimes you can get ones with fans on them. But the modern motherboards that support those drives generally have decent heat shields on them. And if they don't, you want to buy a drive which has a heat shield already attached to it. Some, like the crucial drives, for example, have the option of buying them with a heatsink, and some without. If you've not already got a good heatsink on your motherboard, get the one with the heatsink already on it, and that'll help. When you're installing your system and you've finished and you're installing Windows, one of the mistakes people make is if they've got a Wi-Fi, they haven't plugged in the Wi-Fi antenna. So you might find that not using the Wi-Fi antenna leads to a couple of different issues. One is that Bluetooth doesn't work because the two things are connected. And 2, that the Wi-Fi signal is terrible or non-existent. And that's because you need to plug in the antenna to the back of your machine and then put it somewhere nearby, either on top of the machine or something similar. That helps boost the signal, so from your router you can get a decent Wi-Fi signal, but it also ensures that it works properly. You might find that it's just not working otherwise. It's a simple thing to overlook, but it's included in the motherboard box. Plug that in and that'll help. So hopefully this has been some helpful insights into a variety of different things that can go wrong with your PC build. Check out the links in the description to more specific videos on some of these points that I've talked about. And this has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.